The lights on the set flickered as the camera panned across the sleek modern TV studio. The crowd, a mix of excited fans and curious viewers, watched in anticipation. Today was going to be a special episode of The Talk Show, the most popular evening program with its host Mark, known for his controversial opinions and fearless interviews. Tonight, he had a guest that would make headlines, none other than the famous actor, Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel, a man whose career had spanned decades, walked onto the stage with his signature calm confidence. The audience erupted into applause, but Mark didn't stand to greet him. Instead, Mark gave a small nod and smiled, as if already preparing for the verbal duel he was about to initiate. Vin Diesel, Mark said with a hint of sarcasm in his tone. The man who became a star by driving fast cars, punching bad guys, and promoting mindless action. Some say that your movies are nothing more than explosions and car chases. Is that really all there is to you? The camera zoomed in on Mark's face as he looked directly at Vin, his smile sharp and challenging. The room grew tense. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure of how Vin would respond. The question seemed more like an accusation than an inquiry, and everyone knew Mark's reputation for pressing his guests into uncomfortable corners. Vin, sitting across from him, remained calm. His hands were folded in his lap, his face unreadable. He didn't flinch or react to the sharp tone in Mark's voice. He simply leaned back in his chair and gave a slight smile, almost as if he were amused. But the audience could sense the tension building. Vin's silence felt like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Mark's words hung in the air, and the host, sensing the opportunity to keep his audience hooked, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the moment. Tell me, Vin, did you ever stop to think that maybe you've helped reinforce old stereotypes? That your films, filled with guns, violence, and machismo, have shaped the way people see masculinity and toughness? Do you think there's more to you than just being that guy who saves the day with his fists and fast cars? Vin's smile faded slightly, but he didn't speak. Mark continued, his voice now rising with excitement. You see, I think your movies could have a deeper message, but instead they rely on cheap thrills and empty action. I mean, is that what you really want to be known for? Just a guy who delivers punchlines with fists instead of words? The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. The tension was palpable. Mark's attack was relentless, his tone sharp, like a lion ready to pounce. But Vin still didn't react. He just sat there, his face calm. His eyes locked onto Mark's, never breaking his steady gaze. Mark's smile grew wider as he sensed victory. He thought that his words had finally gotten under Vin's skin. But the audience, many of whom were fans of Vin, could feel something else in the air. Was this really going to be the explosive confrontation they expected? Or was there something more to Vin Diesel than Mark was giving him credit for? So, Vin, Mark continued, shifting his tone slightly, tell me, do you ever wonder if there's more to life than just being the action hero? Could you have taken a different path? Do you think it's too late to change? Or are you stuck in this image that's been built for you? The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable response. Mark was expecting a defensive outburst, perhaps a rant about how Hollywood had typecast Vin. Maybe he thought he would see Vin flinch under the pressure. But Vin just sat there. His expression remained neutral, unbothered. His eyes, though, told a different story. They weren't angry. They weren't hurt. They were calculating. As if Vin was watching the game unfold, waiting for the right moment to make his move. The host's eyes darted across the stage, sensing the growing discomfort in the room. The audience wasn't sure who to root for anymore. Mark had been his usual self, the man who tore into his guests with sharp words, but today it seemed like something had changed. The power dynamic wasn't quite as simple as it seemed. Mark, eager to maintain control, pressed on. I just don't understand why you continue to make these kinds of movies. What do you think that says about you? Are you truly proud of being stuck in this box? Vin Diesel's lips twitched upward, for a moment as if he were about to speak, but then he stopped. The tension in the air grew heavier. Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Was Vin going to ignore him, to walk away from the challenge without even speaking? The host, thinking he was winning, leaned in closer. Come. On, Vin, say something. What do you have to say for yourself? And then, just as everyone thought the silence would last forever, Vin opened his mouth. The audience. The silence after Mark's last question was unbearable. The audience leaned forward, eager to see how Vin Diesel would respond to the sharp criticisms. The studio was heavy with anticipation, and Mark's smug expression seemed to grow more pronounced with every second that passed without a reaction. Vin Diesel's calm demeanor was almost unsettling. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive. He was just sitting there, his hands relaxed in his lap, his eyes steady and focused on Mark. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension in the room grew thicker, the kind of quiet that only comes before a storm. Mark, on the other hand, seemed determined to break that silence. The host, known for his quick wit and sharp tongue, wasn't going to let Vin sit there in quiet defiance. Mark needed a reaction, a moment of weakness, something he could twist to his advantage for his show's ratings. So, Vin, Mark continued, a little more aggressively, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is this really the image you want to project? The tough guy who never changes, who keeps making the same movies over and over. Don't you ever wonder if you're stuck in a rut? Is this really who you are, or is it just who Hollywood made you? Vin's eyes flickered for a moment, his lips tightening ever so slightly. Mark noticed this, and a smug smile spread across his face. He thought he had won. He had finally broken through the actor's calm exterior. But then Vin leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms out slightly, almost casually. The movement caught the attention of everyone in the room. Mark paused, momentarily unsure of what Vin would do next. The studio lights seemed to dim for a moment, the air growing heavier as everyone waited. You're asking if I'm stuck in a rut, Vin said slowly, his voice calm but firm. But I think you've misunderstood something. Mark. His words hung in the air, drawing the attention of the audience, who now sat on the edge of their seats. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but still ready to counter any response. Misunderstood? What exactly do you mean by that? Vin didn't rush to answer. He simply sat there for a moment, studying Mark with a quiet intensity. The room felt like it had shifted. What had started as a casual confrontation now seemed to have become something more personal, something more real. I'm not here to fit into some box you've built for me, Vin said. His voice was measured, but there was an undeniable strength in it. I'm not here to make the movies you think I should make or play the roles you think I should play. I'm here because I love what I do. I'm here because I've worked hard for what I have, and I've stayed true to who I am. Mark leaned forward, pressing again. But is that enough? Is that the legacy you want to leave behind? Explosions, car chases, and cliches? Vin looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. The audience could feel the shift. This was no longer just an interview. It had become a battle of wills. What's enough for you, Mark? Vin asked quietly. What's enough for any of us? You say I'm stuck in a box, but maybe it's not the box that's the problem. Maybe it's the fact that you've already decided what I should be. Maybe you're the one stuck in a box. The room fell silent again. The tension was so thick that it felt like it could snap at any moment. Mark had no immediate response. He blinked as if trying to process what had just been said. His smug smile from earlier faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Vin to turn the tables on him so quickly. The audience, who had been nervously shifting in their seats, now sat in stunned silence. Mark, the confident and sarcastic host, was now caught in a verbal game he didn't seem prepared for. His usual witty remarks weren't landing, and for the first time, Mark didn't know how to react. I've been in this industry for a long time, Mark, Vin continued, his voice calm but unwavering. I didn't get here by listening to people who told me what I should do. I got here by making my own path, by sticking to what I believe in, and by staying true to myself, even when people like you tried to tear me down. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His expression shifted again, this time showing signs of frustration. The studio's atmosphere had shifted as well. What was supposed to be an easy interview, an opportunity for Mark to criticize and expose his guest, had turned into a moment of uncomfortable reflection. Vin's words hung in the air, and Mark seemed lost for a moment. He didn't have a clever response. He didn't have the sharp comeback he was known for. The silence that followed felt like a victory for Vin. But the question on everyone's mind was, would Mark back down, or would he press on? Would Vin's calm resolve be enough to silence the host, or was this just the beginning of a much bigger clash? The silence stretched out longer than anyone expected. Mark's face had lost its previous arrogance, replaced with a faint, uncomfortable uncertainty. He wasn't sure what to do. He had been prepared for the usual back and forth, the typical celebrity deflection, but Vin Diesel wasn't playing by the rules Mark was used to. The audience could sense the shift. Some looked at each other, uncertain whether to applaud Vin's calm defiance or feel sympathy for Mark, who now seemed a little out of his depth. Vin had taken control of the conversation, and Mark had yet to regain it. Vin's eyes never left Mark. His posture remained relaxed, his voice steady. "You keep asking me questions, Mark, like you think you know who I am. But you're missing the point. This industry, these movies, they're just one part of me. If that's all you see, then I'm sorry for you." The words hit Mark harder than he'd anticipated. The room felt colder. Mark, always quick to recover, found himself stumbling for the next thing to say. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, waiting for him to retake control of the interview. But nothing seemed to come to his mind. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out right. He cleared his throat, trying to find his composure. "So you think that's all I see, huh? You think I'm just trying to reduce you to some action figure on the screen?" Mark's voice, though still confident, now carried a hint of frustration. "You think this is all about mindless action?" Vin leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "I didn't say that. I said it's one part of me. I've worked hard to be where I am, Mark. And if all you see is action hero, then you're only seeing one piece of a bigger picture." Mark wasn't used to being the one questioned, to being the one on the defensive. He tried to regain his footing. "So what? You think your movies are somehow deeper than what they seem? Is that your argument?" Vin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, Mark. Sometimes it's not about what's on the surface. Sometimes it's about what's hidden beneath. You look at my movies and you think they're just explosions and car chases. But if you really look, you'll see that the themes of family, loyalty, and overcoming impossible odds are there. Those aren't just cheap thrills." The audience was silent, hanging on every word Vin said. Mark's face showed that he wasn't quite ready to back down, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. For the first time in the interview, he didn't have a clever retort. He didn't know what to say to that. "I respect that you think you know what my movies are about, Mark," Vin continued, his voice calm but firm. "But maybe you need to look at them from a different angle. Maybe you should stop focusing on the explosions and start seeing the heart behind it." Mark blinked. For a moment he was quiet. His mind raced, trying to find a response, but it seemed like Vin's words were echoing in his head. The man sitting across from him wasn't just an action star. He wasn't just a caricature of a tough guy. There was something more there, and it was starting to make Mark question his own approach. But Mark wasn't one to back down easily. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So you're saying all this is about heart? That it's all deep and meaningful? That I should just overlook the fact that your movies glorify violence, promote reckless behavior, and just feed into the very things that the world's trying to change?" Vin didn't flinch. "You can keep seeing it that way if you want. I'm not here to change your opinion, Mark. But maybe, just maybe, you should take a moment to understand why people love these movies, why they resonate with so many, why they inspire people to keep fighting, to keep going, even when the odds are stacked against them." Mark's eyes flickered. It was as if Vin had just landed a blow, but in a way that left Mark confused and unsure of how to respond. He wasn't prepared for this. He was used to controlling the conversation, dominating the narrative, But Vin had shifted the balance. His response wasn't just a defense. It was a challenge to Mark's worldview. The audience, still silent, was clearly caught up in the tension. Some viewers were nodding in agreement with Vin, while others were uncertain, caught between the two opposing forces. Mark had always been the sharp one. But now, for the first time in a long time, he seemed unsure. Vin leaned back in his chair again, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of arrogance, but one of quiet satisfaction. He wasn't here to fight with Mark. He wasn't here to argue. He was simply here to speak his truth, and now Mark was left to reckon with it. Would he continue to attack, or would he back off? Would he continue to press, knowing that he was losing ground? Or would he let the conversation go in a different direction? The silence was deafening. The silence in the studio felt like an eternity. Mark's mind raced, trying to process everything Vin had just said. For the first time in the interview, he felt as if he was losing control. The audience was watching him closely, some with expressions of curiosity, others with clear anticipation. They could sense that the dynamic between the two had shifted completely. Vin Diesel sat back in his chair, unruffled, his eyes still fixed. Mark. There was something calm, almost too calm about the way he spoke. It was like Vin wasn't even trying to win. He wasn't trying to get one over on Mark. He was just speaking his truth, letting the words land where they would. And they were landing hard. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The usual snarky comebacks he had prepared in his mind were nowhere to be found. Vin had caught him off guard in a way he never expected. He wasn't just being confronted with Vin's responses, but with his own biases, his assumptions about the actor, and about the roles he had so easily written off. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime of silence, Mark cleared his throat and said, "Look, Vin, I get that you're trying to defend your movies, but you're missing the bigger picture. We're in a world right now that's changing, that's evolving. The things that used to be celebrated, action, violence, these over-the-top characters, they don't reflect the world we live in anymore." Vin listened patiently, nodding slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He let Mark speak, let the host get his thoughts out, and when Mark finished, Vin's reply came not with anger or frustration, but with quiet clarity. "You're right, Mark. The world is changing," Vin began, his tone steady. "But not all change is for the better. Sometimes change means we lose something important, and what you're talking about, the shift away from action, from bravery, from resilience, it's not the kind of change I want to see. The world needs heroes. The world needs people who will fight for what's right, who will stand up when others are too afraid to. That's not something we should ever lose." Mark looked at him, surprised by the depth in Vin's words. There was no defensiveness, no grand speech of justification, just the simple truth. The kind of truth that wasn't easy to argue against. "You think we need heroes, huh?" Mark asked, his voice softening slightly, the edge that was there earlier beginning to fade. "I'm not sure the world agrees with that anymore. We've seen too many of the wrong kinds of heroes, Vin. We've seen too much violence, too much hate." Vin's eyes narrowed just slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not talking about the kind of hero who uses violence for the wrong reasons. I'm talking about the kind of hero who stands up for others, who uses their strength to protect, not destroy. We need that kind of hero more than ever." The audience shifted, some members nodding quietly, while others were lost in thought. Mark had been the one pushing, trying to get Vin to stumble, to reveal something he could use for his own agenda. But now, Mark wasn't so sure. Vin's words had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and he wasn't sure how to respond to it. For a moment, the air in the studio was thick with tension, but this time it wasn't coming from conflict. It was coming from the realization that maybe there was more to this conversation than either of them had anticipated. Mark finally spoke again, his voice quieter, almost as if he was processing everything in real time. "So you're saying that the movies you make, they're not just about escapism? They're about something deeper?" Vin smiled slightly. "Exactly. You can watch my movies for the explosions and the car chases if you want, Mark. But what you'll miss, what a lot of people miss, is the message underneath it all. The idea that no matter how tough life gets, you fight for what matters. You protect your family, you never give up. The response seemed to settle over Mark like a weight. He had been expecting a comeback, a moment of sharpness from Vin, but instead, he found himself facing a deeper message. He had been so focused on tearing down the idea of the action hero that he hadn't considered the power of the messages those movies conveyed. "I didn't see it like that," Mark admitted, the vulnerability in his voice now undeniable. "I guess I've been too caught up in what I thought was the right way to think. But you're right. Maybe I haven't been seeing the bigger picture." Vin leaned in slightly, his voice still steady but with a hint of warmth. "It's not about being right, Mark. It's about understanding. We all have different perspectives, and that's what makes the world go round. I'm just saying, don't dismiss something just because it's not what you expected." Mark nodded slowly, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely reflective. The interview, which had started with sharp barbs and confrontations, had turned into something else, something deeper. Both men were no longer opponents, but individuals with different perspectives trying to understand each other. The audience, who had been waiting for the next insult or argument, was now watching in rapt silence. They weren't sure what would happen next, but the mood had changed. The tension was still there, but it wasn't about victory anymore. It was about a conversation. Mark took a deep breath, realizing that the interview had taken a turn he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure if he had won or lost, but one thing was clear. He had just learned something he hadn't anticipated. The clash of words had softened into mutual understanding, and in that moment, it seemed like both men had won. But would this new respect last, or was the battle only just beginning? The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. The tension that had initially surrounded the interview had faded, but it was clear that something monumental was about to unfold. Mark sat back in his chair, his usual bravado now replaced with a quiet curiosity. His eyes were no longer focused on finding a weak spot in Vin's arguments, but on understanding the man in front of him. For a brief moment, the cameras cut to the audience. They were captivated by the sudden shift in the conversation. They had come expecting fireworks, clashes of opinions, sharp retorts, and maybe even a bit of drama. Instead, they were witnessing something far more powerful, a moment of vulnerability, of two people acknowledging their differences and trying to see the world from each other's point of view. Vin Diesel, however, was not one to rest on his laurels. The quiet confidence he had displayed so far was only the beginning of what he had to say. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Mark, his voice now carrying the weight of years of experience and self-reflection. "Mark," Vin said, his tone now more serious than it had been all evening, "I understand that you think the world is changing. I get that. I see it too. But here's the thing, you're right. The world is changing, but it's not just about abandoning what came before. It's about finding balance." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Balance?" Vin nodded. "Yes, balance. The world doesn't need to give up everything that came before in order to move forward. You don't need to forget the value of strength, of loyalty, of standing up for others. You just need to learn how to apply those things in a way that's right for today's world." Mark shifted in his chair, processing what Vin had just said. He wasn't sure he agreed completely, but there was something about the simplicity of the idea that made sense. It wasn't about throwing away everything that didn't fit with modern values. It was about finding a new way to approach those values in a world that was constantly changing. "Is that what you think your movies are about?" Mark asked. "Just balance?" Vin smiled, a glint of humor returning to his eyes. "Well, they're about family too," he said, leaning back slightly. "But yes, there's a lot of balance. And a lot of the themes in my films, honor, loyalty, protecting the people you love, those things still matter, and they always will." The audience, who had been hanging on every word, seemed to collectively exhale, a shift occurring in the air room as they processed the depth of the conversation. Even the crew members, who were used to the usual quick-paced interviews, seemed glued to their monitors. Mark paused, letting the weight of Vin's words sink in. He wasn't used to having his own perspective challenged in such a calm, rational way. Normally, he would have dismissed the other person's point of view with a sharp retort, but Vin's approach made him want to listen more closely. "You." "No, I think I've been too quick to judge," Mark said, a rare moment of honesty slipping through. "I've spent so much time criticizing what I don't agree with that I haven't really understood why people still gravitate toward it. I think I've been dismissive. And maybe that's the problem, isn't it?" Vin's eyes softened. "It's not about being dismissive, Mark. It's about understanding. If we can't try to understand where someone else is coming from, then what's the point? That's where we lose each other. I mean, sure, you can criticize all day long, but until you can see the other side, you'll never understand the bigger picture." There was a pause, and Mark sat there reflecting on what Vin had just said. The interview had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and now it seemed like the conversation was less about the opinions of two men and more about something larger, something universal. "I think I've been focusing too much on the loudest voices," Mark admitted. "The ones that seem to be fighting for change by tearing down everything that came before. But maybe I need to consider the voices that are talking about how we can build a better world without erasing everything we've learned along the way." Vin nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Change doesn't have to mean destruction. It can be about growth. And that's something we can all get behind." Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, a sense of clarity washing over him. He had spent the entire interview trying to challenge Vin, but it was clear now that Vin had been challenging him all along. And maybe that was the point of it all. Maybe, just maybe, both of them were on the same side of the conversation, looking for a way to make the world better, but realizing that they had to understand each other first. The audience, sensing the shift in tone, began to react with subtle applause, a few quiet claps turning into a steady rhythm as Mark and Vin both shared. A small, knowing smile. The tension from earlier had melted away, replaced with an unspoken respect between the two men. But just as the conversation seemed to have reached a natural conclusion, Mark leaned forward one last time, his voice carrying the curiosity that had always been his trademark. "So, Vin," he said with a grin, "what's next for you? What's the next step in this journey of balance?" Vin paused for a moment, his eyes twinkling as he prepared to deliver his final thought. He took a breath, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You'll just have to wait and see, Mark. But I promise you this, it's going to be a wild ride." And with that, the interview came to an end. The studio erupted into applause, not just for the entertainment value of the conversation, but for the unexpected depth that had come from it. Both men had walked in expecting a battle, but they had walked out with something much more powerful: mutual respect and the beginning of a new understanding. As the credits rolled and the cameras cut, Mark sat back in his chair, his mind buzzing, with the realization that sometimes the most surprising answers come not from winning a fight, but from having the courage to listen. The show had wrapped up, but the conversation between Mark and Vin Diesel lingered long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The audience had applauded, some giving standing ovations while others exchanged thoughtful glances as they left the studio. It was clear that something significant had happened during that interview, something that wasn't about winning or losing, but about understanding. Backstage, Mark sat in his dressing room staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had interviewed countless celebrities before, but none had left such a lasting impression. His mind replayed the entire conversation with Vin, and it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that maybe he had been wrong. He had entered the interview with one mindset, expecting Vin to be the same as all the other stars, easy to criticize, easy to tear down. But that wasn't what happened. Vin had challenged him in a way that was unexpected. It wasn't with a sharp retort or a dramatic comeback. It was with wisdom, calmness, and a perspective Mark hadn't considered before. The sound of a knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called, surprised to see one of the show's producers standing there. "Mark, we've just had an overwhelming response from the audience. The ratings for this interview are through the roof. People are talking about it everywhere," the producer said, looking at him with a mixture of admiration and surprise. Mark nodded, trying to process the information. "Really? That's unexpected," the producer smiled. "Yeah, it's clear that this was different. People weren't just interested in the typical clash of opinions. They were invested in the real conversation that happened between you two. They want more of that." Mark leaned back in his chair, his mind still racing from the interview. "I didn't expect it to go that way. Honestly, I thought I had him cornered at first. But then, as the conversation went on, it was like something clicked." "You mean the balance thing?" the producer asked, raising an eyebrow. "It was powerful, and it seems to have struck a chord with a lot of people." Mark chuckled softly, running his fingers through his hair. "Yeah, the balance thing. I guess I've been so focused on pushing forward that I forgot that it's okay to build on what came before, instead of trying to tear it all down. It's a bit humbling, to be honest. You're not the only one who feels that way. A lot of people are talking about it. They're saying..." The interview opened their eyes to something bigger than just movies or TV shows. It's about the world we live in. Mark sighed, looking down at the floor for a moment. He hadn't realized how much he needed this shift in perspective until now. "You know, sometimes I think I've spent so much time trying to be the voice of change that I forgot the importance of listening. It feels like I've missed out on a lot." The producer nodded. "Well, you're definitely not the only one. A lot of people are seeing things differently after today." Mark smiled, a little sheepishly. "I guess I've learned a lot from Vin Diesel, and from this experience. It's funny how you can think you know everything, and then someone comes along and teaches you something you didn't even know you needed to learn." Meanwhile, across town, Vin Diesel was in his own dressing room, reflecting on the interview. He had expected to be put on the defensive, especially given Mark's reputation for aggressive questioning. But instead, he had found an opportunity to share something more meaningful. The world was changing, yes, but it didn't have to mean abandoning everything that came before. Vin's message had been clear. Progress didn't have to erase the past. It could build on it, using the best parts to create something better. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with messages from friends, family, and even other celebrities. The feedback was overwhelming. Everyone had watched the interview, and they all seemed to agree on one thing. It had been a turning point. Not just for Mark, but for the entire audience. Vin smiled to himself. He had gone into that interview not knowing exactly what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just about the movies or the fame. It was about the people, the stories, and the lessons they could learn from each other. It was about finding balance in a world that was constantly moving forward, and doing so with respect, humility, and understanding. The next day, the interview went viral. Clips from the conversation were shared across social media platforms, with millions of people discussing the profound message that had come out of it. Mark's show gained more traction than ever before, and Vin's message resonated with fans from all walks of life. And as for Mark, he found himself considering a new approach for his future interviews. Maybe it wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or stirring up conflict for ratings. Maybe it was about creating space for meaningful conversations. Conversations that could change not just one person's perspective, but the perspectives of millions. For both Mark and Vin, the interview had been more than just an exchange of words. It had been the start of something greater. Something that didn't just challenge their individual beliefs, but helped them discover the power of understanding, respect, and growth. And as they both moved forward, they knew that whatever came next, it would be something worth watching.